Again, we welcome you to track one, the fun track. You have two other tracks going on through the ahc2021.com. You can go back and forth. This topic is going to be resilience and energy during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's speakers, Haley Sipple, Manager, National Security Policy, Edison Electric Institute, Anna Balance, Advisor, Policy and Partnerships at the Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center, Channing Spencer, Cyber and Infrastructure Security Assistant, Edison Electric Institute, and Amanda Cermick, Manager of Security for American Gas Association. The floor is yours and welcome.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having us today. I think we have a couple of slides if we can figure out how to pull them up. Awesome. There we go. All right, we can go ahead and skip to the next slide and just jump into it. So today you've got a couple of folks from different energy trade associations and information sharing organizations, and we're going to talk with only mild PTSD about the ways that the energy sector pulled together in the early days and weeks and months, hopefully not years, of the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure that we remained resilient and reliable working together. What I hope that you'll take away from this discussion is that our industry's initial and ongoing response was quick to get off the ground and remained agile and adaptable as situations and information developed and changed really rapidly. We can go ahead and start with a round of introductions. I know we've said who all is on here, but we can talk a little bit about ourselves. I'm Haley Sipple with EEI. Manager of National Security Policy there, and I'm also a member of the Secretariat for the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. I'll be talking a lot about the ESCC today, so in just a few minutes I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that organization is for anyone who doesn't know. Channing, tell us about yourself.
Hi everyone, I am Channing Spencer. I am with the Edison Electric Institute as well, working with Haley. I support the Security and Preparedness Department at the Edison Electric Institute and also the ESCC Secretariat, which Haley will talk a little bit more about during her section. So glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Anna, who are you?
Thanks, Haley. Hi everyone, I'm Anna Balance, Policy and Partnerships Advisor at the Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center. I've been at the EISAC for just over about 6 months, or just under about 6 months actually. I made a transition over to our organization last year during remote work, and you could say during the pandemic. We're still in the pandemic, but I worked on Haley and Channing's team at the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council on that portfolio through Edison Electric Institute. So I will highlight a few experiences from both sides, but I look forward to sharing with you today on these topics.
She's our double agent today. And then Amanda.
Thanks, Haley. I'm Amanda Schrammick with the American Gas Association. I'm also a member of the Oil and Natural Gas Sector Coordinating Council. So I'm going to kind of provide some perspective on the natural gas and the ONG SEC as well, kind of our early days, how we started to coordinate and get together, and kind of how we were able to remain so resilient. So thanks.
Excellent. So the focus of this discussion today will be on the innovative and resourceful processes and mechanisms for information sharing and communication that were developed really on the fly when the need presented itself early in the pandemic, and on how those processes contributed to the sector's effective and efficient sharing of guidance and recommendations to really address unforeseen issues and potential issues that we were called on to speak to that we never had to think about before. You'll see on this slide, there's a couple of things that we're going to talk about, different things that contributed to that resilience. One of those is just how we established those mechanisms for coordination and communication across the industry, so working with our own companies and with our own member companies. Second, we'll talk a little bit about new ways that we ended up working with the federal government and then state and local government partners as well, and some new relationships that we had to build there, as well as some new ways that we had to use old relationships that I think were very beneficial and interesting. And lastly, we'll talk about some of the really dynamic and adaptable guidance that we put out to all of our members and to the industry and how the guidance was used. We may or may not talk about it in this order, but if as long as we get it all out there, I think we'll be fine. I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about the ESCC's experience on this first point, if that's okay with everybody. For those who aren't familiar with the ESCC, we are the principal liaison between the electricity sector and the federal government, apologies, for when it comes to national level disasters and threats to critical infrastructure. We deal a lot with things like hurricanes and wildfires and things that you traditionally think of as sort of national level engagement situations. The organization is 32 members strong, made up of CEOs from across the subsector, including several of EEI's investor-owned electric companies, plus public power utilities and rural electric cooperatives as well, and then some other trade associations and folks like the EISAC. In this role, we're certainly not new to emergency response. Like I said, we do lots of storms. We have very well-defined and well-practiced mechanisms in place for standing up emergency industry government coordination when it comes to things that you traditionally think of as those national level disasters. But there was no precedent for responding to anything like COVID-19. Knowing that we needed to act quickly and that coordination across the sector is really our bread and butter, we did what we were best at, and we pulled all of our smartest industry friends together to form what we called the Tactical Tiger Team. This was about mid-March, so it was as soon as it was clear to us that COVID-19, although it wasn't a pandemic yet, it was an epidemic that was going to hit us and was going to impact us, and we needed to be prepared. This small group of very smart friends turned out after really just a week or 2 weeks of pulling people together to be hundreds of security and emergency response professionals from across the industry. And with that kind of volunteer force, we were able to divide the Tactical Tiger Team, which was one big sweeping group to address all of our issues, into a set of various Tiger teams focused on enabling the industry to continue operations in a number of different areas. I'll talk a little more about a few of these later on and when we talk about the guidance that we put out, but those areas included accessing quarantined and restricted environments, control center continuity, generation operational continuity, supply chain challenges became a big issue, mutual assistance preparation became a big issue as we rolled into storm season, responsible return and re-entry as folks started figuring out how to continue working and how to go back into the offices, public and internal communications, and then some telecom and IT challenges as well. So really we did hit a huge number of topics and worked with just an enormous group of people with different expertise and different experiences. These categories generally capture the various roles and responsibilities and relationships that our industry has. And I'll talk a little bit more later about some of that specific guidance based in some of those areas. But for now, what's really important to know is that we had folks and they were hard at work developing and refining guidance in these areas based on past experiences and specialized expertise, based on the relationships that we were able to leverage, and with very little situational awareness about the impacts of the virus that really was unfolding very slowly, while guidance and information coming from the government was changing and unfolding very rapidly. So we had a lot of different directions that we were being pulled, and not a lot of clarity around the information that we had and the potential of the impacts that we knew were possible. The strength of this group, I think, really came from being such a diverse body of different experiences and different expertise, different resources, but one aligned objective to mitigate the impacts of the virus on the energy grid to the best of our ability. This group wasn't just folks from the electric subsector. We included a handful of cross-sector partners, especially our oil and natural gas friends. And then we worked closely with the ISAC, the EISAC, and our government partners as well, which we can talk about a little later. I'll pause here. That's the basic description of the setup that we had in place while we were developing guidance. I'll turn to Channing to talk in a little bit more detail about how EEI was able to effectively share information across our own member companies and leverage their expertise to inform this guidance. Channing?
Thanks, Haley. So I will be talking a little bit about the second point on this slide here, which is the EEI single points of contact community that we set up. This is separate from the Tiger Team structure that Haley had just mentioned and consists only of EEI's members to coordinate on COVID-related issues. And single points of contact actually reduced itself, and I'll reference it throughout my little talk, called the SPOC community, SPOC. A little bit of a Star Trek reference there, which we like to humor ourselves with. But yeah, it's become the SPOC community to us. And the aim of this group is really to address issues related to company operations and power delivery during COVID. We knew from the beginning that one of our, like the core aspects of our industry is that the power cannot turn off. It's the lifeblood of our economy. It's what keeps everyone here teleworking as we are now. And you may have noticed that your lights haven't gone off as much because of the pandemic specifically. So we think that we've been really successful throughout this. But when we approached this from the beginning, as I'm sure many have discussed earlier in these presentations, it's led to a whole slate of completely novel issues that we've had to address. And the focus of this group really began with issues that now seem really trivial, like how do we get out of the office and just set up our computers and work securely? That was one of the first issues that we really had to deal with, and this community was fired up in the midst of a lot of companies making that move for the first time. But it's continuously evolved in our focuses, and really today, things like vaccine prioritization, vaccine distribution are at the top of the focus for the community. So a little bit of why the SPOC community was really successful specifically, primarily really having a single point of contact from each company really provided a smooth flow of information between those company reps and the trade association EEI and to the rest of the member company staff. In the early months, like Haley said, really chaotic environment and responding to and getting to all of the different information that was out there, often conflicting. So these single points of contact, rather than having interactions between multiple different staff at a company and EEI, really led to a steady flow of information that was reliable to each of those folks. And this encouraged really the member companies to collaborate internally more so with their SPOC representatives rather than coming to the trade associations repeatedly. So that really helped the community success as well. And I think that I wanted to mention as well, this really is reflective of the electric sector's culture of camaraderie that's been mentioned, especially related to mutual assistance engagement. We really saw a lot of the member companies be very willing to provide information and even detailed plans of their different policies related to reentry or issues like sequestration. And this really helped other companies involved in the communities who maybe hadn't done that much thought about these issues to really have a great foundation to begin with and really develop policies that were going to be more effective in addressing their needs related to the pandemic. So I really think that point specifically related to the camaraderie of mutual assistance was a huge reason why this is successful. And now, and we know that going forward with other issues that come up on our doorstep, we'll be able to rely on that as well. The SPOC community provided a lot of value for our members. I mean, it served as a touch point for everyone to come together at first twice weekly, then weekly, and we've adjusted the frequencies of those calls as we've gone along. Currently, we're on a once a month schedule, but it really helped us be agile in responding to what was a barrage of new information and changing strategies related to the onset of the pandemic and how to manage when we were in the thick of it back this summer and even to this day. So I think that the value of that peer awareness between the owner operators and developing the timing and the substance of their different internal policies was really critical into making this a success. And of course, these ranged in complexity, things as simple as there's a gas leak in my town. How do I make sure the field workers going to fix it have the right equipment? How do I make sure that they don't get sick and doing their day-to-day jobs? To things as complex as, how do I sequester my critical control room workers if there's an outbreak in my workforce? I mean, these are things that no one had ever thought about up until this moment, but having that touch point to make sure, hey, am I going about this policy right, and being able to discuss it was really critical to the whole team. And currently, we've actually had a little bit of a rebirth of the SPOC community. So the SPOC name is a little bit of a misnomer. We're now allowing all of the staff who are willing to be a part of it, or all the companies, to join in on the calls and engage. So it's no longer the single points of contact, but we're keeping the name because we really like it. Yeah, like I said, we're operating on an array of conference calls that have a changing schedule and a consistently changing schedule. So as the virus's rate of spread has risen and fallen, so has the frequency of calls. So while the impacts of COVID are still really clearly severe today, the amount of new policy issues that we're dealing with is really plateaued. So decreasing that schedule has been the result. So now to build up people's schedules with calls that might be unnecessary, because as I'm all sure we know, our schedules are back to back with calls all day long, and some of them are more important than others. Moving on, each call, we really had a consistent substance to each call going along. Primarily, it would consist of an update on the spread and the impact of the virus, and the impacts of government action as well, from leading healthcare professionals, particularly Dr. Rebecca Katz, who was incredibly helpful to us for many months during the pandemic and is now part of the Biden administration and has had her hands all over their coronavirus plan, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. But these days we're relying on the generosity of our member companies really to provide their chief medical advisors to give briefings to the wider community. And there's a huge advantage to this, especially early in the pandemic, for folks on the calls to ask direct questions to the medical advisors in order to understand their opinions on things in an environment where there's a lot of changing information. I think that provided a lot of value as well. And typically the calls would really rely heavily on those briefings from folks like Dr. Rebecca Katz. And then throughout the calls, we also had roundtable portions to allow for open conversation. And this really allowed for us to identify new issues and understand what our members' needs were. And this built into what we used primarily as our tool of information sharing, which was quick response surveys via the Qualtrics platform. So those tools have been incredibly effective. We would use the calls to identify new policy issues and also issues that folks were having with ongoing ones. It would be something as simple as checking in on what the rates of infection were in your workforce, to a snapshot of exactly where you were in a reentry process, all the way to things as simple as, hey, are the frequency of these calls doing enough for you? Should we ramp up or ramp down? And what we would do with that information is actually anonymize all of it, aggregate it, and then post it to a file sharing workroom that we maintain for our members. So that was a great place for people to go back way early in the pandemic and go back to the surveys we were doing back in April and see what kind of things their peers were saying, and be able to reference that in making policy judgments going forward. And like I said earlier, surveys really focused on information about the impacts of the virus at the very beginning, things like initial teleworking strategies, how to conduct field work, were folks getting enough PPE? What do you do if you're trying to access an environment where you know someone who's infected has been there? And then one thing which has been really serious throughout the entire year has been mental health support for the workforce, which was something that we focused on as well. One other thing that I'll mention about the value of this community was that it really helped all of our members judge how to collaborate with their local government, and from things that ranged as far as from dealing with stay-at-home orders with mission essential workers. We didn't even realize at the beginning that some of these stay-at-home orders that were being implemented by governors across the country would actually impact our company's workers and going around and doing things like fixing down power lines. Some folks were getting pulled over and asked, why are you out? And it's kind of hard to explain, wow, I'm doing something extremely critical, without there being an actual caveat for those folks being out and about. So things that were as simple as that, but not all members' experiences were equal. Some municipalities certainly more proactive than others. So the engagement in the SPOC community really helped them adjust their approach on that as needed. And I'll just highlight some of the, the most important things that we saw, some of the most great examples of information sharing. When we had multiple companies share full blueprints of their sequestration operations, down to the workers they hired and the types of vehicles that they had folks living in, eating in, to work in these control centers. Those really helped some of the smaller utilities involved ramp up quickly, and if they needed to, if the regional spread got too serious, they could start to sequester workers in that scenario. Some companies shared extremely detailed stages and protocols based on regional COVID spread for when to ramp up and ramp down their office reentry. That's something that's still ongoing. Some companies have 50%, some 90%, some 100%, some 0% of their workers currently in the office. But getting that peer reference to be able to understand when to ramp that up and down, extremely critical for maintaining that. And then through the ESCC mostly, but the EEI spot community really had a large role too in coordinating with wider groups of industry, including the American Gas Association, ESCC members, the American Public Power Association, and National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, and even Canadian partners at CEA to get a snapshot of reentry practices as they went. So we actually surveyed all of our members during a particular time frame and said, hey, what are you doing in terms of office reentry? How many folks do you have in the office? What kind of mitigation strategies are you employing? And we're able to share that information across the entire subsector so that folks really knew, okay, this is where my peers are at in getting their folks back into the office and maybe making policy judgments based on that. So we've progressed through a really difficult time. We think that the structures really proved themselves as successful methods to coordinate in this uncertain environment. And I think it's done a lot for folks' peer awareness and to be able to develop internal policies effectively in an environment where things are constantly changing and the value of the information you're getting is really only as much as what you're able to share with your partners. So that's just a little bit about the EEI spot community. I know it's a lot of information. I'm happy to answer further questions about how it was structured and how we pulled this off offline, but I'll pass it back to you, Haley, in the meantime. Thank you.
All right, I think the real takeaway there is just the spirit of sharing that we were able to harness in all of our members was the #1 contributor to our being able to do what we did and keep the lights on for everybody. Amanda, I'll turn it over to you to talk about some of the structures that AGA had in place.
Sure, thanks, Haley, and thanks, Channing, that was great. AGA had some similar processes. We didn't have a cool name like the SPOC, but we did have an information sharing mechanism put in place. They were very generically called our COVID calls, so not as cool of a name. But we held those twice a week for the first couple of months actually, and it was mainly just an information sharing platform. We had 100 to 200 people on a call at any given time, and that was a quick way to just say, what's going on? Like, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? What questions do you have? What issues are you having? Can AGA help you coordinate with the federal government? Can someone who may have already gone through this before give you some feedback? For example, in Oregon and California, they were telling us what they were seeing on the ground, and the folks in New York were like, oh my gosh, this is coming. I mean, you can see the numbers going up and you can see the hot spots. And so, Oregon and California were saying, all right, New York, this is what we did. This is what we went through. And they kind of had a way to prep for that. If you can call it that, but it was very interesting to see that. And then of course, New York was a huge hotspot, and then it went down the East Coast, and then it just got everywhere. But in the very early days, it was very important to have those calls so often. So twice a week seems like a lot for, I think we had an hour and 15-minute call. And we typically had one company that had a share. So they kind of presented on one specific issue or event that may have happened or lessons learned that they had. And then that was maybe about half hour, and then a half hour of roundtable. So that discussion was just so important in getting people to understand some of the issues that were going on. Some companies shared policies that they had to implement on the fly, like driving separate vehicles. You can't go on a field call and be in the same vehicle with someone. So they had to implement a policy where, you know, some person had to have the field vehicle and then the other person had to drive their own vehicle. And then what do you do with the insurance for that person? And all those kind of questions that came up on these kind of calls. We also, Channing had talked about the control room sequestration. So there was a lot of people who, you know, they couldn't not go to work. They had to go to work. Otherwise the gas wouldn't flow. So we had some companies do some creative things like get hotel rooms, rent RVs. So they had a big parking lot of RVs, and all the control room operators were living out of these RVs. When they were living in the RVs, they had to hire cooks. And so they had an RV with a chef who would make meals for all these people. We had people who would do the laundry and try to take care of all that stuff that the control room people were working overtime, and they just couldn't deal with that. We also had questions come up like, if people were sequestering, was it, the normal hazard pay or was it a normal pay? And then we had people who had to go into the homes of someone who may or may not be infected. How do you ask these people, do you have COVID? So we had a group of companies that shared scripts that they had developed for health screening. And this was all done prior to entering the home. So the operator who was going into the home knew, hey, this person is not feeling well, so you need to ask them if they can go into a separate room, or, you know, just these scripts that had been developed were so helpful. So people didn't get to the front door and just not know what to do. We also had people concerned about, well, what can you restrict people's personal travel? So if someone goes on vacation and they come back, can you say, you are just in a hotspot, you can't come into the office? And if you don't let them come to the office, is that sick time? Is it PTO? Is it, you know, just regular paid administrative leave? Like, how do you deal with that? So there's a lot of different topics that came up, and just great information sharing between the companies. We also had some informal surveys that we put out where it was like a spitfire, where, hey, Department of Energy or HHS asked us, we can get you some PPE, some face coverings or some gloves or some sanitizer. How many do you need? And so we had to go to all of our members, who had to go to all of their utility workers and say, okay, how many gloves do you need? So we were counting down to the gloves, like, how many do you need? How many face masks do you need? So those were done within a couple hours and returned back to the government. And they helped get us procure some of those, the much needed PPE in the very, very early days. We also had informal surveys of return to work, as Channing had said, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. And then we also had very formal surveys. We call them SOSs, and that's typically when a company, it just needs some guidance. They need to know what their peers are doing to make sure that they're on level. So it's called an SOS survey. And a lot of those were, in addition to the formal return to work surveys, there were some control room staffing. How are you doing this? Are you splitting this up into group A, group B? Are you doing shift work? Are you having completely separate locations? So we had control rooms that were kind of like split to 2 or 3 different locations. So group A would only go to location A, group B would only go to location B. So there was no cross contamination. So it was just the huge amount of sharing of information and trial and error that helped us become this resilient. That's about what I wanted to talk about our coordination call. So Haley, I'll pass it back over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. I will kick it right over to Anna to talk about the EISEC.
Thanks, Haley, Channing, and Amanda. I'm like, as you were going through all of our examples of those specific scenarios, because all of our operations are so on the ground, even though we're based in DC and our services are, you know, to our members, I'm just reliving all of those events as they were
a little bit of PTSD, right?
A little bit. No. So I do want to go back a little bit to where Haley kicked us off through the ESDC Tiger teams, and that's really where for the EISEC, where we engaged externally through as a mechanism for coordination and communicating across industry. So as Haley said, so the ESCC began its Unity of Effort calls already in March 12th, so middle of March, and that's when we basically by the end of March, the Tiger sub-teams had formed to identify the priorities of focus and areas of concern to be discussed at the leadership level. So the EISEC specifically committed people. We committed 2 staff members to the supply chain and generation sub-teams. Together, we helped to convene calls, relay member reporting where relevant, and share subject matter expertise, especially into the critical supplies for generation operations areas. I wanted to highlight that the Tiger team model was so effective and 2 levels of that come to mind. So one was that it's a traditional work group of subject matter expert peers who could pool real-time experience, as my colleagues have already mentioned, as certain situations were unfolding, especially when it came to sequestration, testing, et cetera. And so evaluation of what was working, and then have that, and then draft and direct that straight into the resource guide, kind of as a real-time feedback mechanism to then disseminate that across industry. And I thought that was one pretty neat characteristic of, and that was unique to this Tiger team model. Secondly, it was a natural, convenient mechanism to feed the priorities from the on-the-ground experience directly back over to the CEO government conversations that were happening through the ESCC, through those Unity of Effort calls. On those calls, that's where we as in the whole council, the whole industry, were engaging at the leadership level with CDC and with DHS, FEMA, with CISA, and through DOE. Specifically as our formerly known as sector-specific agency. So those 2 points have made the Tiger team model so successful, in addition to its really catchy name. So as the last point, like any good model, it's flexible and replicable. We're even using it now for supply chain compromise follow-up. So that's one external area where the ISAC is a part of this stakeholder community in response to COVID as a whole. My second sort of story or narrative that I'd like to highlight is how we adapted internally as an organization. I think our story is similar to for those of you on the call. So the close to home example for our shift to business continuity mode and dealing with the challenges of a remote work environment is that of the EISEC's watch operations team. So it's our watch floor. So back in June of 2019, the EISEC's member executive committee had set up a benchmark of having our watch floor operational 24/5 by end of year 2019, and aim to be 24/7 as soon as possible following that, so pre-pandemic. And by February of 2020, when we were monitoring the spread of COVID, and at that time had begun piloting 24/7 model, evaluating shift duration and responsibilities of what the watch floor analysts would do, given an expanded shift work. So in February, the EISEC leadership and NERC leadership were transitioning all staff members to work from home. Yeah, remember those days. So like many of our other organizations, that was about the time frame in the DC area where maybe some critical teams were in office, maybe IT, et cetera, but everyone was transitioning to work from home, and it had to happen fast. So the EISEC additionally had to quickly adapt and ensure continuity of operations for program management structures and technical connectivity for the CRISP program, for example. CRISP is a cybersecurity and risk information sharing program that the EISAC manages in partnership with Pacific Northwest National Lab. The program functions involve bidirectional sensor data exchange of energy sector participants, so to identify and alert to malicious cyber traffic on networks. So needless to say, it's a critical program and service we manage. By July, we had new hires and a dedicated staff. We're operational on a 24/7 by 365 basis. We've just onboarded our 5th and 6th Watch Ops analysts. So as an overall perspective, if this is any reflection of how the EISAC has evolved in such a short time and how members are also utilizing and contributing to portal content. In February of 2020, informational posts tallied 26 compared to December 2020, where members and Watch analysts published 107 unique posts to the electricity community. So I share that with you as we see that as an increase in production and as a success, progress, and testament to the collective efforts towards a more resilient sector in the face of COVID and the emergency threats that came about in 2020. To this day, we're still providing the functions of the EISAC fully remote. And those are my example of our internal shifts that I think mirror some of the same experiences that you all have had transitioning your operations to remote work. We see it as a success.
Thanks, Anna. So I saw that we have a question in the chat about collaboration and coordination with the other 15 critical infrastructure sectors. I know that you've hit on that a little bit while you were talking, Anna. And I think that's also a really good segue into talking about the ways that we work with government. One of the key ways that we worked with DHS was through these ESF 14 cross-sector information sharing calls. And we really got a chance to talk to all of the critical infrastructure sectors about things like PPE and testing and vaccine development. One thing in particular that DHS was really good at talking about and that we didn't get from any other corner of the conversations that were going on is the idea of combating misinformation. So that was something that all different sectors were dealing with. And I think we had a really unique channel to talk through that with the different sectors through DHS. We certainly worked closely with DOE. We have battle rhythms that are tried and true. We worked with them in a couple of ways that were novel, like Amanda mentioned the surveys that they sent out, or the RFIs rather, where they would say, we can get you masks. How many masks do you need? And so we would have to go out and find out how many masks we're going to need within a couple of hours. So that was a new way to sort of leverage that relationship. One other way that we worked with DOE and DHS was through the promotion of our sector as being mission essential workers. So we really early on developed some guidance about who in our sector was mission essential. And that guidance was used by DOE to advocate at the federal level with, and really at the state and local level too, with governors that we ought to be treated as mission essential and able to access places that are restricted otherwise, and able to have that caveat so that we can move around and do critical work when other people are, under a stay-at-home order or a stop work order. And also with DHS, through their mission essential guidance that they work with the CDC to prioritize things like vaccine distribution. That has been a huge help for our industry, really throughout the entire process, being able to work with DHS and DOE to define our critical role that way. We did develop some new relationships with CDC, is someone we certainly had never thought to talk to before, and now we're talking to them twice a week. And then we worked with state and local governments in some new ways as well, particularly around things like those access issues, but also other prioritization and things like distributing PPE, other kinds of prioritization issues. I don't know, Amanda, if you want to add anything from the oil side of things or natural gas side of things.
Sorry, I had to find my mute button. Yeah, it was really interesting in that we kind of had to learn how to deal with or how to build the relationship in a different way with the state and locals, because we're used to dealing with FEMA, DHS, DOE. And so when we're on our calls talking with our members and they're saying, we need sanitizer, we need this, we need the ability to get through, you know, our pipelines run cross states and the state has a travel ban. And so our, you know, state, one utility works in one state, but they live in another state. And so how do we get them back and forth? And so that's what Haley was kind of talking about, the critical workers guidance that DHS had put out. And we found out that really didn't help as much as we thought it was with the state and local folks, where they had their state and local ordinances and it was totally different. I mean, they were like, this is great. We understand you guys, you know, are doing something important, but you know, we have our own processes. And so that was a real big challenge. And, you know, early on, and then, you know, now as we're starting to go through, that was kind of in the PPE stage. Now we're going through the vaccine stage. And I think that most of our members have now built the relationship. So that's you know, that's great that they now have the direct relationships with the state and local governments. So they know, you know how to get to the person who can help you best. So that was a very new relationship that we had to build. And it turned out to be, I think, a success story.
So we are quickly running up on our time. I do want to, Channing, if you can move to the next slide, I do want to talk a little bit about the products and the guidance that we were able to put out from all of these experiences and all of the expertise that we had. You've heard stories about how different trade associations were sharing that information and different companies were coming to the table with really detailed experiences and plans and willing to share really everything with each other for the sake of this goal. So we took all of that information a little bit at a time, but pretty rapidly, and compiled it into something that we call the resource guide. The resource guide was put out by the ESCC. It started out in March as 6 really valuable pages of guidance that our members were grateful for and used in a number of ways. I think at this time it's about 130 really valuable pages of guidance because we had so much evolving information and so many new experiences and so many volunteers who wanted to help us define what some considerations are for circumstances that our companies would have never thought of in a million years before this, and really lay out what worked for them and what didn't work for them. Importantly, the resource guide is not a set of best practices. It doesn't say utilities should do X in Y circumstance. What it is a set of considerations and a set of shared experiences. So because it's written in such a way, because it needs to be so adaptable and so flexible that it can work for many different kinds of organizations and in many different situations, and as information continues to evolve and change. That was a real challenge. It's much easier to say, do this, don't do that, than it is to say, here are all of the things that you need to think about. But because we did this in such a way that it really was sort of a choose your own adventure book, it was taken up by many different sectors and adapted for use in other situations. It was taken up internationally and used in other countries. It really saw a lot of use that we certainly did not foresee when we sat down and wrote those 6 pages. or even when we pulled together all of these very smart people. So seeing it evolve into something that really was useful and will continue to be useful, no matter what direction this pandemic goes, or God forbid, if we have to use it again in the future, that information is going to be valuable even when things have changed. Now, I do want to point out in my 2 minutes that I have to talk, just a couple of examples of the guidance that did come out. And I think I'll run through it really quickly because we've talked about most of them already. Sequestration is one of the biggest issues for our companies at the very beginning of the pandemic because nobody knew what to do. Nobody had done this before. I know Channing talked in a lot of detail and Amanda talked in a lot of detail about filling up a parking lot with RVs. That kind of information was extremely useful to our companies as they were doing this for the very first time. We talked about supply chain issues that we had never had to talk about before. Everything from how do we get PPE to how do we make sure that our natural gas is still flowing. We talked about how do we access work areas that are quarantined. Like Amanda said, how do we make that script that works when we have to go in and talk to someone in a very delicate way? And then this is the very last point I'm going to make. We, in March and April, while we were writing this, we had one eye on this and one eye on storm season, which was quickly approaching in June and July. So one of the things that we knew we had to do was dedicate some time here to talk about how do we do mutual assistance where we're sending folks from different companies across the country, lodging them together, having them work with new people every day. How do we do this in a pandemic environment? And we were able to develop a really comprehensive mutual assistance checklist that our companies used during a really robust storm season, and there were no super spreader events, no significant spreading. So that was a huge success that came out of this Tiger Team work. Channing, I think at this point, we can go to the next slide and start taking questions if that works for everybody else.
We actually have 1 minute.
1 minute left.
Haley, I did just want to mention on following on with the resource guide, since the ONGSEC and the ESCC work so closely together, we didn't want to, the oil and natural gas sector certainly didn't want to develop another document for guidance, but we did develop an ONGSEC responsible recovery compendium. And I'll just give you one example of what we had, one of the findings we had. So I think everyone can imagine by the time April came around, there was a ton of people that were like, I got to mulch or I got to do some home improvement projects. So we had a ton of people that were not calling before they dig. You see that like call before you dig, the 811. And so there's a lot of people that were digging into pipelines and stuff like that. So we had to develop an awareness campaign for just making people aware. If you're going to be out and about doing all your home improvement, you make sure to call 811. But there was a ton of resources in that compendium and the resource guide to help. So just wanted to mention that.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. I forget sometimes that you're not us. We work so closely together.
Very good. We want to thank our panelists. Great job, especially that closing comment. I think a lot of folks forgot about the fact that we also had other emergencies that EEI and others had to prepare for. So great job. Thank you very much to all the panelists. And we're going to move over to the next presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.